the fact that we're the first ever tech natives. I mean, most of us have been exposed to tech our whole lives. Most of us, I was born the same year as Google, and most of us were born around that time or afterwards. So we haven't really lived without this tech. And I think that that gives us more ability to engage meaningfully because we see firsthand the impacts of what that means.
Welcome back to Tech Pathways, the podcast that goes beyond the headlines to introduce you to the real people shaping the future of technology. Today's guest is a force in philanthropy and tech policy, but her path to the space, anything but traditional. Meet Kyla Kasharian. She's not a software engineer. She didn't study computer science. She never expected to work in tech, yet today, she's helping drive the future of innovation at the Siegel Family Endowment, ensuring that technology serves society, not just the bottom line. Kyla's journey is a testament to the idea that tech isn't just about coding, it's about people. The industry needs leaders with different perspectives, lived experiences, and deep understandings of the world beyond just Silicon Valley. And Kyla, she's proof that the most unexpected paths often lead to the biggest impact. In this episode, we're going to explore how debating the international crises in Model UN led her to tech policy, why the future of technology depends on voices from the humanities, and the moment she realized philanthropy wasn't just about giving money, it's about shifting power. Finally, we're going to talk about how growing up, traveling the world, gave her a unique perspective on leadership and tech and philanthropy. Kyla, it's so great to have you for today's conversation. It's been an incredible week for us, and we're so excited to have you as we're launching into this new program and getting ready to launch all of our amazing podcast episodes. Particularly excited because I think we're going to nerd out a little bit in this episode, talking about the different things that we've done in high school that kind of got us involved in leadership and giving back to community. The first thing that we're going to talk about is a global perspective on leadership. You have Orlando roots. You grew up in a close-knit family, stepping naturally into the role of responsible older sibling. I'm the youngest sibling, so we'll talk about that. How did that shape your leadership style, being the oldest sibling in a tight-knit family?
Yeah, I think it shaped me a lot. But first off, so glad to be here. I'm really excited to be having this conversation. And thank you for taking the time out of y'all's busy schedule to, squeeze me in. But yeah, I was born and raised in Orlando, Florida, with my two parents and my younger brother. So we can definitely discuss those dynamics. But saying responsible older sibling, I think, is a really nice way to say like overbearing older sister. So I appreciate that phrasing. But I think that there really is something to be said about older siblings and especially oldest daughters in like propensity to leadership. Just because, the way the society expects girls to mature faster and to take on responsibility sooner and to, step into that, I think develops those skills a little bit earlier in girls, which, I think can be an asset as much as it is, a difficulty and hindrance growing up. But I think specifically being an oldest daughter also helps develop some of those nurturing skills. I think inevitably you care for your younger siblings. So I think it builds really well-rounded leaders of, being able to take on that responsibility and that stress and being a little bit neurotic, but also, having that sort of nurturing and caring aspect of your leadership style as well. Sort of, I don't know, I think it shaped me and I see it a lot in other women that, grew up in a similar environment
Yeah,
that I did.
I think that's totally right. And I have to say, as the youngest of four, I have an older sister who's next kind of to me in our four siblings. And having that older sister was honestly such a life hack. I really think that like I lucked out having someone that taught me how to cook, that taught me how to organize myself, bullied me just enough to make sure that I always presented well. And those dynamics are something I don't take for granted as the younger sibling now, as that we're adults and we have this like awesome friendship. My sister and I, and our other siblings, but her and I particularly are very close with that older sister dynamic. Um, but it is a responsibility, right? It is Yeah, I don't know how else to put it. It's a responsibility, a little bit of a weight, and so it's interesting to always hear the other side of that because I'm sure there were times that you were driven crazy. I know I was driving my older sister crazy a lot, um, but the people skills you get are like unmatched, right? I mean, having to day in day out deal with folks in a way, right, to like get along at home. I think there's something there. I think having siblings is amazing. To anybody that has an older sister, like you lucked out. Older sisters are the best.
I'm gonna send
Um,
this to my younger brother. So
yeah, please do. Yeah. Is there a big age gap between you all?
no, we're 3.5 years apart. So I
Okay.
think it was actually a really great age gap in that we were able
Hmm.
to live kind of separate lives in a way, in that we never really were in school at the same time. We actually ended up going to different high schools altogether, and like we didn't overlap, which I think was really nice, and being able to fortify our identities separately, but then come together in the home and be able to, like have that as our common ground. But I think you're so right that as we've gotten older, we've gotten a lot closer. And I think I'm less intense and he's, growing into his responsibility and becoming an adult. And, I'm so proud of him. So I think there's, all those strange dynamics of siblinghood kind of mellow out in your adulthood. But I think, there's learning that goes both ways. I've learned so much from my brother and younger siblings too. And I think he's learned from me. So I don't know. I think we all hopefully come out of it better people.
I have to say to close out this question, I'm an uncle. My sister has four children, and and that dynamic is really interesting as well because when you start to see your sibling as a parent, you kind of get a kick out of it. It's kind of funny to kind of see them interacting, right? Especially when there's multiple siblings, because then they're dealing with that sibling dynamic. Um, but I love it. I think it's just so awesome, and that respect that you get with your siblings as you get older is awesome. Less fighting, more like just OG friend energy. I love it. Um, so this is actually really, really incredible. Talking about perspective on leadership, you traveled to 20 countries before turning 18. That must have given you a really unique global lens. I want to talk about that. Is there something that you think you experienced throughout your travel at such a young age that shifted your view on life, on leadership?
Yeah, yeah. Traveling was super integral to my life growing up. My father is from Brazil and worked in Latin America for his whole career. So we did a lot of traveling in Latin America, but also, went to Europe and was really, really lucky to be able to have those life experiences. And I cherish them really deeply. And I don't know if there's any one moment that particularly shaped the way that I think about things, but I do think there was a bunch of small moments that sort of aggregated into something larger. I think two sides of it. One being in high school, I was learning Spanish early in my journey, and being in Latin America and meeting so many people that were English language learners and having conversations where I was speaking in Spanish and they were speaking in English, and that connecting cross culturally and having the patience with one another and that genuine excitement of, being able to practice and being comfortable and accepting in that. And I think that was really beautiful. And I still to this day really value opportunities to practice language with people. And I think that creates such a common ground. So I valued that so much. I think the other side of it is that history is so old and the world is so old. And the American perspective, barring native cultures, which are unfortunately not really accessible to the general public, the American perspective is super young. So I think being able to travel and see the history firsthand and how it's documented, I think it leads us to, grapple with how are we repeating history and how are we forging a new path and how can we do better than we have in the past. And I think that that's such a valuable piece of information for people to have early on, because it sets you in context. And I think it gives you that sort of motivation to, create a better society in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think, and I can't say that I traveled that much before turning 18, but but having that like cross-cultural exchange, I think is huge. And I wish that more folks had access to experiencing, what it is to step outside of your operating culture, and be, connected to other communities, other societies, other cultures. Uh, I think it really does shape individuals into, well-rounded members of society with perspective to step out, right, and kind of look at things from a bird's eye view, so to speak. And I can imagine that that's really, really helpful in asking these really large questions in your work today, which I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because we're going to talk about that. But I can imagine that's awesome perspective to have, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. And I think that global perspective is something that, we're still trying in our work today. Again, I don't want to skip ahead, but I think we're a really global society, and I think we're more connected than ever, and we're exposed to more, international perspectives than ever, which I think is so valuable. I think sometimes people get a little nervous by that and are jaded by that. And I think you see it more and more in today's political sphere and in society at large. But those cross-cultural connections are what bring us together as humans, not as people from certain countries or different backgrounds. I think there's something really universal there when you're able to connect one-on-one with people. So I feel really grateful that I was able to have those experiences early on.
Yeah. That's awesome. So I have a one final question in this topic of uh, perspective on leadership, and it's about soccer. You were deep into sports growing up. What did playing soccer teach you about strategy, teamwork, and resilience? And how did you get started in soccer? Where did that passion come from?
Well, I mean, mentioning that I have a Brazilian father, it's probably not super surprising that I played soccer growing up. Yeah, but that passion was instilled by him. Grew up watching soccer every weekend, started playing when I think I was like probably 5, and played all the way through graduating high school. It really enveloped my family's life. It was sort of how we all found common ground. We loved it. I loved it. And I feel really grateful for the time that I had playing the sport. And I think I learned a lot from it in different ways. I think the big one for me was accountability structures. I have a really strong work ethic, but I do think I'm naturally a little bit lazy. I'm a bit of a procrastinator. And we'll always choose to stay home and hang out on the couch. But soccer was sort of an external accountability mechanism for me. And I think it taught me how important that is for me. And now, as an adult, I purposefully orchestrate those things for me, because I think that's one of the most difficult things of transitioning into work life and being an adult, is that nobody is, keeping track of you anymore except your boss, but the stakes are much higher. So building those accountability mechanisms of like setting my own deadlines, even if they're not real, and leveraging my coworkers and my husband and my friends as accountability mechanisms, even though I don't even think they know that they are that. I just hate disappointing
Hmm.
them. So they're my accountability mechanism. Um, that was super valuable. I think also there's something to be said about positions in soccer and how, everyone has a different fit that works for them because of natural skill sets. I think you can learn any skill set to a certain degree, but there's something to be said for really leaning into what you're naturally good at. You know, not everyone is fit to be a forward, not everyone's fit to be a goalkeeper just naturally. And I think that that's okay, because they're both extremely valuable things. And I think that's true in work life as well. Identifying what your natural skill set is and leaning into that and deciding to go deep and fortifying who you are and what skills you bring to the table, I think is really valuable. Like, I think in soccer, it's very rare that the best player on the field is the captain. It's more likely the person that's most inclined towards leadership. So I think, we all sort of have different strengths that we bring to the table, and they're all super valuable. And identifying that early on, I think, is pivotal. And the last thing I'll say here is that I know we're talking about soccer, but sports more broadly, I also played golf my senior year of high school, which was super random, like kind of on a whim. I signed up because my math teacher was the coach and he asked. And I think that was one of like the best experiences that I've had, because it was like risk taking, genuinely coming in. I had no skill set. I had like no real interest in golf, but here I was, and ended up being pretty good, and I loved it. And it was such like a challenge and a new thing to explore. And I think that was one of the few times where I stepped out of my comfort zone, like wholeheartedly, and just dove straight into it. And I think since then I have done that more often, and
Mm.
it was really formative for me. So shout out to golf.
I love that assessment. And you bring something up that I had not thought about, which is that the role dynamic, right? And in soccer specifically, I have to like I'll share I ran cross country and track in high school. And you kind of saw that a little bit, right? With like, especially in track, right? You'd kind of pick your specific, sport within track and field. Um, and I've definitely had experiences where I was just not the right fit. But the team aspect of soccer, right? Like working with folks and really seeing their skill set shine through when you're working as a team together, but with very different roles. I think that is really interesting to think about. I hadn't thought about that, so I really love that, like that narrative, that kind of analysis. Um, and you said something as we were starting this question about accountability, about the way that sports kind of like gives you, I think, some perspective as well as a leader. And I do think that for me, that like running, particularly long distance running, uh, gives me that sense of like discipline, that sense of like clarity, accountability, um, that is really transferable when you are someone that maybe likes their leisure time, but likes to exercise that muscle of endurance, of accountability. And so, huge fan. I do think that like when you are a um, an academically oriented kid who also enjoys kind of that physical challenge of sport, uh, you get the best of both worlds. And there's a lot that I would take from one to the other. I mean, running is I don't know. I'd probably say like at least 80% like mental, right? Especially when you do those long distances and you have to like distract yourself with something. Um, yeah, and I think that the same is true for a lot of sport, and that transferable skill. Uh, I love that. I'm starting to get a sense of that perspective that you shaped really early on as a leader, which I mean is incredible. Sport, like that international perspective, that's really, really cool. It sounds like you were just killing it at a young age, which is awesome. We're going to get into the second part of our conversation here and talk a little bit about Model UN, and how that led you to philanthropy, which I'm really curious about. I will admit I was a mock trial kid. Um, yeah. and and I actually our team, our little town made it to the state championships, which was awesome. No resources, no like formal like class structure to it. We just got ourselves there. And in California, it's no joke. I don't know what it's like in other states, but um, it was intense. Some of those kids maybe took it a little too seriously, but mad respect for the Model UN, really. So so did you have like diplomacy dreams as a kid? What got you into Model UN?
Yeah. So I don't know. I think I was one of those like really odd kids that knew or thought I knew very early on what I wanted to do. I wanted to go into international relations and diplomacy. I felt really strongly about that, mostly because of the travel that I did. And because of that, I started an internship that was extremely short lived at the UNA USA chapter in Orlando. And most of that internship was developing Model UN resources, which I had never done before. So, crash course for sure, but learned a lot there. And then when I went to college, we had a Model UN team there that I joined along with all of my friends. And it became like the most core experience of my college career. So that's sort of how I got into it, and it just spiraled from there.
Okay, so if I'm reading this correctly, you then started a podcast on foreign policy. I want to know about that. Like you were really like what led you to that to start a podcast?
So it wasn't about foreign policy. It was about Model UN more specifically.
Okay.
And I'll give the caveat here that the kind of Model UN that I did is probably not the kind that most people are familiar with. So there's General Assembly Model UN, which is, being the UN, you're a country doing all of that. This style is called crisis model UN, and it
Mm,
follows the same structure of like legislation and diplomacy, but you are in much stranger circumstances. So I mean, like I played a deceased Incan emperor once, and I played like Elliot Alderson from Mr. Robot in a Jurassic Park committee. So it's like it's pretty out there. So that kind of model UN is a little bit rare, but that's typically what's done on the college scale. So the podcast was sort of grown out of like a real lack of resources about that kind of model UN. Uh,
mm.
my friends and I were super passionate about it. Shout out to Caroline and Casey, my college roommates and still my best friends. We started it together just because it felt like it was something the community needed. And we were super passionate. And we had like the most lovely reception from like the community and folks that we knew. And people listened. I mean, it was niche, it was nothing like this, but we had such a great time doing it. And I think that sort of community that we built around it was really lovely. We only did it for a couple of years, but folks still listen to the episodes on occasion. So I'll take that as a win.
Yeah. I think that's totally a win, right? Like if you're able to build a resource, a conversation, I think in many ways that's what we try to do, right? And it's still bringing in folks who are learning and maybe applying it in ways that we may not even know. I think that's a win, 100%. And that's really interesting. Those are really out there scenarios. That's really cool. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in some of those scenarios. Um, I have to ask because this is one of my favorite shows, and I'm curious as a a model UN aficionado, like, are you a fan? So I have to ask, have you seen Madam Secretary?
No, but everyone recommends it to me.
Yeah, you totally should watch it. I've probably seen it 3 times over now at this point. Um, it's very good, and I appreciate it as someone that's in Washington, D.C., because um, it's a little bit more realistic than most DC shows, and I love the diplomacy aspect of it actually a lot. I think they do a really wonderful job. A few of our former real secretaries of state actually make cameos multiple times, so I think that's almost an endorsement on their part as well. So I'm a huge fan of the show. I think you would really like it. That's just based off of our conversation so far. Um, we'll get back to everyone and with an update on whether or not it gets the thumbs up. But a
I will
huge
let you know.
recommendation. Yeah, it's a great show. I'm probably gonna watch it at some point later today. Um, so you made a bit of a career pivot, but I want to be careful about that word because maybe that's not the right word to use, right? I think in many ways what you've expressed so far about your background and that perspective that you've had growing up, it doesn't necessarily surprise me that you ended up in a space where you have to think critically, you have to look forward and build relationship, strategize on impact. This seems like a very organic trajectory, I would say, but maybe potentially it wasn't at the time or didn't feel that way. But let's talk about that pivot. So you were set on, this diplomacy work, government, foreign relations, and then you found yourself drawn to philanthropy. What was the moment that made you realize that that is where you wanted to direct your impact?
Yeah. Well, I think I appreciate that perspective, and it's very kind of you to frame it that way. And I think, like in retrospect, I think you're right that it does make sense as a trajectory, but it definitely felt like a pivot at the time. So My last year of college was kind of interesting. I ended up graduating early. I decided to graduate early. I did not end up pursuing a master's degree in diplomacy like I thought that I would, and decided that I didn't want to go the government or diplomacy route in large part because of all of the information that I gained from my degree. I wanted to work in Latin America. There's a lot of really historical injustices perpetuated by the US and Latin America. And I felt, ethically, and it wasn't something that was aligned with my values to work with that. So I went and, was trying to find the internships that I needed to graduate. So I ended up taking one with a nonprofit in New York City, working in food access work. I did government relations for them. And I when I was graduating early, I kind of was just like, would you guys hire me? And they, really kindly said yes. So I ended up working in the nonprofit sector, but instead of doing government relations, I was doing government grants management and government fundraising, which, if you talk to anybody in that space, it's pretty brutal. It's really challenging, and let alone right now, considering, the US environment, but it's a tough role. And I think what was so eye-opening to me was everyone acknowledged like, oh, government grants is so hard. But all my peers, working on private philanthropy, foundation fundraising, even individual donors, it wasn't that different for them. It was really hard work too. It's the hoops you have to jump through, the application processes, the administration of the grants was really, really challenging. And I loved the work, like being able to firsthand impact community and provide the resources for that was everything to me. I adored it. And I realized that like that system's broken. The funding to community the process is way too arduous, and it's such a problem in creating actual social change. So, in the fundraising side of things, you don't have a lot of power to change that. So I felt that philanthropy was the pivot that I needed to make to start exacting change there, and, start helping move the sector in a way that was more equitable, in hopes of helping future, nonprofit fundraising professionals have a little bit easier of a go, and so that they can benefit their communities more. So it was sort of out of necessity, it felt like, but I've loved being in philanthropy since I've pivoted over, and I think that it's really been a formative time for sure.
I really appreciate you talking about that experience, that trajectory, I guess, pivoting into, if we're still using that word, philanthropy, because I think this is where we get that chunk of the conversation that someone who is maybe experiencing that shift or thinking a little bit more critically about their place working in a nonprofit or, working in government relations, but wanting to give a little bit more back, seeing some of those bottlenecks or some of those, barriers to really build impact might have a light bulb moment and say, ah, okay, that makes sense. Like, I see that in my, in my experience. Maybe this is the pivot I can make, or this is the shift I can make to better actualize the the impact that I want to make. And so I really appreciate that. Thank you for sharing. I really think that that's what these conversations are about. So I really love that. Um, y- and 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 I'm curious. I have some of that perspective as well. I think I could, but I won't, go into detail about working with really small, niche, intersectional communities, nonprofits that struggle for funding, right? And it is a reality, especially when you look at specific communities that are not quite getting their proportional share of philanthropy dollars, and it's it can feel hard uh, to push impact when there are still some of these discrepancies even within our giving um, landscape, right? But getting some of that agency is wonderful. And I have to say, I'm a fan because I've seen some of the content that you all are putting out where you talk about the ease that you want to give the folks that you're working with to actually experiment a little bit and learn through trial and error, pivot, I think some of that flexibility in of itself, as you're working with individual leaders and organizations and campaigns, it makes all the difference. It's that like little bit of grace, right? That extra bit of grace that we give folks as they are trying to make change in our communities. And I appreciate that a lot. I also have to say I admire what you're saying about, your perspective and your work wanting to get involved in Latin America. As someone who's Mexican American, who one of my areas of study was Latin American studies, I appreciate that a lot. And I'm happy to have that perspective, your perspective, in the philanthropy space as well. Again, I know we're saying the word pivot, but I think that trajectory was amazing for you to bring all of that into this work. On that note, and while we're still on the topic about kind of this landing on philanthropy, I want to talk about philanthropy as power. So many see philanthropy as simply distributing grants, but you've emphasized that it is actually about shifting power. When did that click for you after getting kind of into the space?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is right, that traditional philanthropy is just distributing grants. And I think that's what the problem is. It's traditionally kind of pay for impact. It's I give you a grant and you give me these metrics in return, and that's where it ends. It's still very much guided by wealth, and less by community. And that sort of philanthropy structure still very much exists today. But that's not what it should be. And I think the work that we're doing at Siegel sort of proves that it doesn't have to be that way. Um, Grantee-centric philanthropy is sort of turning that on its head and thinking about, okay, so I am approaching a grantee on an even playing field. We are the same in this relationship. They have external expertise that I simply do not have. They are connected with their community. They have skill sets that are extremely valuable, and they are a wealth of knowledge, and philanthropy benefits from that. So just as there's an exchange of dollars, there's a large exchange of information happening as well. And because we're approaching this equally, grantees shouldn't just be giving us the metrics that they're asking for. They should be part of developing what that evaluation looks like. They should be able to guide the direction of the grant, tell us what needs to happen, tell us what they're learning. And then we should be changing our strategies based off of that, not the other way around, of asking grantees to shift because this is what we want them to do. So, honestly, I think all of that is really logical when you think about it. Like, these are people that are professionals in their community doing great work. Who are we to think that we know better and that we should be parachuting in and dictating what policy and what, work on the ground should look like? So that sort of reciprocal relationship is really based on trust, and it takes time to develop because a lot of people are jaded about philanthropy because of that transactional historical model. But I think what we're doing is much more impactful, and it's about that shifting of power. And I think that it's really resonating, and I think things are changing. But as for when that clicked for me, I think it actually predated philanthropy. It was in the nonprofit sector of realizing that we have so much to give, and that philanthropy has so much capital to give, that there's something that needs to meet in the middle. And the disparity is that power of, nonprofits should be on that equal basis. And they are not in the traditional model. So being able to help with elevating those folks and, creating more of an equal playing field has been a real joy of my work so far.
I really appreciate you saying that. And it actually, what it brings up for me is a conversation that I was having yesterday with one of our team members about this ever faster cultural, political, economical, um, what's the word? Kind of turnover in trends, and a lot of that, coming from this kind of like content creation and content consumption on digital platforms that is moving much more quickly, right? Our fashion trends, the issues we're talking about, the shows we're talking about, all of this is kind of being sped through at faster rates because of these platforms where trends can come and go so quickly. And I can imagine that when we're thinking about the philanthropy space and we're talking about, these large, wonderful funds that are thinking, how can we build impact? How can we get involved in some of this work, in campaign work, in this initiative work, this organization's work, to drive the mission forward? When you're using dated systems to to distribute, to assess, to reevaluate, you are not adapting enough to meet that shift as well, right? That like ever increasing shift in the way that folks are working within these trends. And that's just, I don't think that's a way, an easy way, I should say, to operate with all of the shifts that we're seeing in the digital world, which is something that we talk about at Zeta a lot, right? How are we adjusting to the digital world? And I think that when I hear you speak as a young leader in this space, I see, what is the future of philanthropy to come, and that's really exciting. A space where there's collaboration, open conversation, right? A mutual exchange and acknowledgement of different areas of expertise that are brought to the table, because it's a crazy fast moving world out there, and all industries have to be ready to adjust to that. And so that's really exciting for me to hear. Again, right, like those perspectives that you bring are really interesting. And I do want to move us into a part of the conversation where we're talking about tech. uh, Very timely, right? That's our work here at Zeta, is elevating Gen Z in tech policy, bridging a lot of those communities between policy and tech. Um, and I have to ask, as someone that didn't necessarily have a tech background, did you ever encounter a sense of imposter syndrome? How did you adjust to kind of entering that space initially around tech?
Oh my gosh, yes, all the time. And I think I still have it on occasion because of exactly what you're saying. Tech is so fast moving and there's always something new. And a great joy of my job is how often I get to meet with the most brilliant practitioners and tech developers. But I don't know how you couldn't have imposter syndrome talking to these folks. They're brilliant, and the things that they're thinking about are so innovative. And without a tech background, it can be really challenging. But I joined Siegel knowing that this was going to be a tech-based job. Our mission, very broadly, is to understand and shape the impact of technology on society. So it's in everything that we do. And I think getting comfortable with that and sort of overcoming the imposter syndrome sort of came through two things. One being my leadership is just amazing. And if there's folks in leadership listening, I think that there's such an important part to play there of reaching young people and elevating them and empowering them. My boss put a lot of faith in me and trust and knew that I had the capacity to do it. So, he empowered me to do it. He would invite me on all his calls, empower me to ask questions, get me in front of people to learn and to try things out. And that was so formative for me. And I think also always leading with curiosity, checking egos at the door, being genuine and asking your questions, and, showing up saying, I just don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? Folks will always meet you with grace. If you're coming with genuine curiosity, and it's the fastest way to learn is being able to engage in those conversations. And I can remember thinking, about, 6 months into my job, where I had been meeting with these, nonprofit tech developers, and just out of asking question from one call and then a new question in the next call, and then in the next call, 6 months in, I knew what to ask. I understood the lingo. I understood the background. I understood the red flags and what we should be looking for and what the opportunities were. So it can happen faster than you think, getting acclimated, if you're willing to lead with that curiosity and humility as well.
Yeah. There's something that you said that I think people need to hear again, which is acknowledging that there were leaders in your journey that elevated your young perspective and leadership. And I think that that is so critical. And if anyone, is in a position of power, which I think many of us are, and have the opportunity to elevate others into positions of leadership who are younger, who just need an opportunity, who have great potential, need a little bit of guidance in, identifying their own potential, do it, right? Let's be intentional about elevating young voices. I know that I have so many incredible leaders that saw potential in me at a young age and elevated my voice to thank for um, for where I am today. And so having those supportive environments make a world of difference, really truly. And so I want to repeat that for folks that are listening. Let's all keep elevating those younger voices. I know we talk a lot about creating um, leadership pipelines. What that really looks like in practice is just asking us to step in, asking us for thoughts, ideas, encouraging us. It really is. It's those little simple things that make a huge difference in cultivating new leadership, young leadership, innovation within an organization. And it seems like you all are really knocking it out of the park, clearly, because they have you. And so that's incredible. I'm so excited for that. You in some of the content that I've come across, you talk about philanthropy being society's risk capital, and it's something that I think for those folks that are maybe familiar with the space, they've heard before. But what does that mean in practice, particularly in cultivating the future of tech? What does philanthropy um, being society's risk capital mean?
Yeah. So this is sort of a thesis that's really core to our work. And I want to credit Rob Reich and Arnold Zurcher, which are, the academics behind this sort of frame of thinking. But we really adopted it into our work. And I think generally speaking, what it means is that philanthropy is uniquely poised to de-risk solutions for societal change, mostly because we don't need a profit. Traditional funding pathways, like most notably VC, are really unwilling to take on first loss or to take on projects that are not broadly financially supported or are extremely expensive with no return. But oftentimes, those are the projects that are most needed to actually help the world. So philanthropy, because we have so much capital and have no shareholders or stakeholders to give returns to, we're uniquely poised to be the intervention point there. And even other funding mechanisms that are beyond philanthropy, like government grants, with my background, most of them require match funding too. So you need first capital and you need first dollars um, to be able to actually launch work. And philanthropy is able to do that. We also have a much longer time span that we're comfortable working in. I think VCs typically want to start seeing returns pretty quickly, and that patient capital is really, really valuable early on in ventures. And philanthropy can be that, both through, MRIs and PRIs, which we don't have to get into right now, but those are like more traditional funding mechanisms, but also through grants. And tech specifically really needs that right now. If we want to start developing ethical public interest tech, we need that sort of patient capital, and we need that money to get the solutions de-risked so we can crowd in other funding. Tech is developed at the whims of profit, as we all know. There's a lot of money at play, and it's mostly based off of what is going to make the most money in return, not off of what's going to be the most impactful, what's reaching the most people, what's solving the biggest problems. In large part because those are tough questions and it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to solve them. But that's where philanthropy can sort of come in and hopefully lead towards those solutions.
Leaning specifically into tech, what would you say is one of the more challenging or exciting tech topics that you've uh, been able to dive into at Siegel?
So many. I think right now, what I'm most excited about is sort of community informed R&D efforts. We do a lot of work with AI, and that's very exciting too. And if we want to talk about AI later, we can. But we have several partners that are really developing these great R&D infrastructures, and nonprofit tech doesn't have the same R&D resources that traditional tech does. And they also work on sort of a different time scale. But the way that we're thinking about R&D with our partners is how can we make sure that we're getting voices of community members in there? It's not just, does this product work? Does it look good? Is the UX good? Like so on and so forth. It's, is this meeting the needs of community? Like we do a lot of work in ed tech. So how are we getting students in here to test these products? How are we getting teachers in here to test these products and genuinely taking their feedback and making sure that companies are instilling it in their products, and we're creating tech that's actually informed by the people that will use it, is super exciting. And mostly because I think there's so many lessons from that can be magnified to tech more broadly. But it's really important work, and feel excited on that front.
That's really interesting, and that got me a little bit excited because I some of the work that I've done in the past is around education policy, and actually I think I may have been, I think, the first Latino and youngest elected person in my hometown, small town in Northern California. But I was a trustee. I was a trustee on the school board of our little one school board, or school district, I should say. And as a kid, I was 15 when I was on the board. I was doing the most sometimes, but I was on the board, ESL kid, so I had kind of that language learning experience, and I think I had an interaction that really makes me think now about the way that our school systems, particularly our rural school systems, are integrating tech. And we can have a whole nother conversation about how difficult it is to do that in rural America with just connectivity, right? I mean, I don't, yeah, I don't think I had a decent internet connection until I was like a senior in high school, in our small rural town. But that is a barrier. And as someone who was an ESL kid, I remember sitting in a school board meeting as we were reviewing our ESL program, and the conversation definitely needing a little bit more community input, and being kind of taken aback, and finding myself as, again, this young kid on this board, having to speak up and say, hey, you know what? Like, yes, I am a product of this program. That's all great and all. But let's talk about how many more folks should be kind of, examples that we can point to that are success indicators. And I think the way that we're talking about the integration of tech, AI, into particularly rural school districts, makes me think about that experience that I had, because it's very hard to connect with all of these districts, to give them the context, the tools, while understanding their capacity limits in implementing this very rapidly developing technology, right? Um, AI is getting more and more complex every year, um, every month. And there's a huge question around how do we integrate this, and how do we make sure that these gaps in access aren't widening, um, for rural Americans in particular. I'm advocating for them because I'm a rural American, or was a rural American growing up, and so I think about that a lot. I don't know if that's something that comes to mind for you all, or that you've talked about. I'm sure you have.
Oh my gosh, everything you just brought up, just absolutely amazing. Would love to talk offline, or maybe we have a whole other episode about rural
Yeah.
America, because that
Yeah.
is a huge focus for us right now. And it's so fascinating, the work that's being done in spite of the digital divide that exists
Hmm.
and the lack of broadband access. Still such fantastic work and really awesome examples. I think most specifically that there's so much learning that's happening in rural America that can go towards urban areas, whereas I think
Yeah.
typically we think it has to go the other way around. But yeah, also, I mean, what amazing work being a trustee at 15. That's just spectacular. And I wish more communities would adopt that. That sort of perspective is so valuable. Most people that are on trustee boards have not been in school for 40 years.
Yeah.
There's no context there, and bringing, even an active teacher in is great, but most notably if you can bring students in, you hear what's real and what they're actually interested in, what they're actually doing, rather than just prescribing it based off of what you read online and what you think is going on. Is so valuable. So amazing that you were able to have that experience. I love that.
100%. I still don't it was an interesting experience that came about, and I was there until I graduated. I was there for sophomore, junior, senior year, until I left California. Um, but it did, I thought it was an incredible opportunity that they had, as a voting trustee, right? And it definitely, I have to say, there is a whole nother conversation there about how does that shift dynamics between students and their ability to really, be heard. Because I have to say, like, that dynamic between me and my principal, once I was approving their budget, it really changed. That was a very different dynamic. Yeah, that was fun. It was very cool. It was a very cool opportunity for a young kid, looking to just get involved, get more involved, and um, really, really, I mean, just dove off the deep end, into the local leadership space. But there is a lot more to talk about there, particularly around connectivity, because it is something that we think about a lot, right? Grid modernization, um, the really really complex conversations that have to be had with our rural communities, tribal communities, all sorts of different I was talking to somebody from Pennsylvania not that long ago, who works all over the state, particularly with the Amish community. And so you have these demographics and these communities that have their own opinions as well on how they want to be integrated or not, into um, this connectivity effort. And so it is very complex, but it's definitely a problem going into kind of our next segment that we as young folks have to start thinking about, right? I mean, we need to make sure that the infrastructure that we have for the digital world in the United States is going to be able to carry us through the 21st century. And there is so much more coming, so much more content, data that's going to have to be processed through our existing infrastructure. We are going to have a huge like modernization effort there, right? Um, and that leads me kind of into this next section, which is the future of leadership in tech and philanthropy. I think this is a good segue. So, Gen Z's role. As part of the first Gen Z wave leading in philanthropy and tech, how do you see our generation reshaping these industries?
I mean, I think what I'm about to say is, no surprise to any of you, but I think the fact that we're the first ever tech natives, I mean, most of us have been exposed to tech our whole lives. Most of us, I was born the same year as Google, and most of us were born around that time or afterwards. So we haven't really lived without this tech. And I think that that gives us more ability to engage meaningfully because we see firsthand the impacts of what that means. I think it's different if the advent of the internet came after you and you lived a life without it. I think the perspective is just skewed. So I think there's so much value in that perspective from Gen Z. But I think also because of that internet access and tech access, we're also the most multi-talented group of people that have existed thus far. We've had information at our fingertips. We've seen more perspectives. We're more well-rounded. And I think more outspoken because of the platform that we've been able to cultivate as a generation that didn't really exist previously. It's a much more democratic platform as well, and in its ideal form, in that anybody can speak out and contribute. And I think that that empowers us as a generation. And I think that many people see the disillusionment that Gen Z has with society as being a negative thing, but I think that that's actually really powerful, and that we're looking with clear eyes and have the tools at our fingertips to do something about it. And I think the general fervor to do it is really exciting. So I think there's so many obvious strengths of Gen Z, and I think it's already moving in that direction. I think it's such an exciting time and feel very lucky to be part of this, the Gen Z wave.
I couldn't agree more. I think as those first digital natives, there's such an opportunity, um, and there's a clear-eyedness to it that you talk about, and I think that's 100% accurate. I do think that Gen Z is the generation that's looking to act in the digital world, and own the reshaping of it, leading us through, the kind of meat of the 21st century, as we continue to get older. I call myself a geriatric Gen Z. I'm like right at almost at the cutoff. So I'm a little on the older side of the Gen Z community. Um, but I think especially the younger Gen Z folks that are still coming up through high school, are really, starting to think critically about, the role of tech, the way that tech is integrating, because they're experiencing it now, right? We have Gen Z students that are in high school having to shift and adapt, as AI is being integrated into their education, shifting the way they even have to think about like career trajectory and longevity, and the reskilling, of uh, their work, as they're still thinking about what it is that they want to do. And so I think that'll continue to have a huge impact, and then lead Gen Z to take a much more like active, role in shaping the digital world, which I'm very excited for. Um, if you had $100 million right now in your pocket, uh, very heavy pocket, toward a press that you wanted to allocate towards a pressing tech issue, where would you invest it and why?
That's such a good question. I think there's probably two lanes I would take. One would be that community informed R&D infrastructure, because I've already talked about that. I'll skip that part. I think more work around the impact of AI on labor. I think figuring out how we can build solutions to help Gen Z that is coming up and becoming the workers of tomorrow be equipped with the skills to be successful in an AI economy is so vital. And I think that goes far beyond just like prompt engineering, which is, I think, what we're doing right now. It's more around how to engage critically with media, how to engage critically with AI, and understanding the backing of AI and what it is and how to use it and how it works is so vital. And then on the flip side, thinking about on the employer side, how are we holding employers accountable for the tech that they're implementing? And how are we holding tech developers accountable for the tech that they're creating, in surveillance of workers, in automation of labor? It's going to be a huge societal reckoning, I feel. And I think early investment now to try and mitigate harms is so vital. So if I had 100 million, that's what I would be doing.
You know what? I'm right there with you, and I would sign up to be a part of that effort, because what I hear being kind of, in these spaces in the federal policy work of it all here in Washington, D.C., is just so much concern for workforce, workforce development, workforce needs, for industries where the workforce is aging out, or new industries where we don't quite have the folks with the skill sets right now, but we're going to need them around quantum, around energy, around AI, broadband. There's so many industries out there that need our young workforce. Industries that are great middle class jobs, right? That are stable, that are exciting, new, and I know that we're building out some good policy priorities and campaign work around better, kind of collecting this workforce development um, need that needs to be met by our generation and generations to come. And we got to start talking about that as a generation. We have to start looking at that conversation critically to say, where are these jobs that are going to be, available to us in the next 20, 40 years that are AI resilient, that are climate resilient. And I think that that's my conservation background coming out as well. Um, and I think we need to own that, because the folks that are leading right now that are concerned are not us. They're not the ones that are going to be filling those jobs, and so they need to hear from us, right? In us saying like, hey, let's look at our youth here, and figure out how we can have a conversation with our youth about meeting these needs, entering these spaces, and cultivating that talent. We have talent here. Gen Z is talented, as we said, and so there's so much work there to do. I think that's a great use of your $100 million. Um, so we're going to start to kind of close this out here, but I want to wrap up with this last question for the section on the future of leadership in tech. Many young people feel like they don't belong in tech because, again, maybe they didn't follow a traditional tech route. What would be your advice to them?
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, as someone who is now in tech without any traditional tech background, I think it makes me better for the work, honestly. Tech is very white, very male, very CS, very Ivy League, you know, everything you think of when it's tech. That's all true. But tech impacts all of us. That the people that are developing the tech are not the only people that are harmed by tech or helped by tech. So every voice is really vital. And it, to me, is more about developing that passion and hope for community, and how we can use tech as a tool to create a better future that sounds more appealing than, oh, I'm going to build a new tech platform, because that's not what that tech means. It doesn't mean that you have to go work for Google. You don't have to work for Facebook. Working in tech can be tech policy. It can be working in the nonprofit space. It can be in philanthropy. There's so many realms of what tech work is, and having all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of different demographics is so important for our tech enabled future, which is inevitable. So we have to take that agency now to get involved and to get passionate, and to commit to helping future generations have a better experience with tech, and to make sure that we're instilling our values into the tech that's being developed now. And we can't do that without equal representation. So if it feels something that you're drawn to, take that risk, take that jump. There is space for you. You can carve out a role, and there are people there to help you. There's all the folks at Zeta, are great evidence of that, of the community that's being built. And there's more out there. So, I think that there's so much possibility.
Yes, please join us, folks. I think there's so much opportunity here for voices of all backgrounds in the space. And I have to also share. I don't have a formal tech educational background, but again, it's that avenue for me was the policy work, and seeing the intersections on conservation, on education, on financial literacy, on so much civic engagement, democracy. Tech is here and it's touching all of us. And so there's so many different avenues. In one way or another, I think most folks in our generation, as we continue to go through the 21st century, will start to work in tech, right? All right, Kyla, if there's one big idea you hope all listeners take away from this conversation, what would that be?
I think there's two, if you'll allow me
Okay.
to.
Yeah, of course.
One is just reiterating that all pathways to tech are super valuable. There is no limit to what you can achieve if you decide that you want to achieve it. So go out and join tech. There, you can do it. I think the other side of it is the value of community. I think right now more than ever, leaning on community, lifting each other up, using any power that you have to lift up others is so valuable. And finding community and cultivating it is so necessary. So taking the opportunity to do that and taking the brain power to do that when you can, I think will not only benefit you, but just the world more broadly.
Yeah, 100%. I appreciate that so much, and I'm sure that the folks that are listening do too. I have to ask you our closeout question, which is our fun question. Just love getting everyone's thoughts on this. The closeout question is, what is your current favorite tech tool and why?
That's such a good question. Hmm.
Mine changes every week.
This is so hard. You know, this is like maybe like kind of a rudimentary concept, but just because I use it all the time and I love the accessibility that it brings, the iPad and the Apple Pencil. I love it. I love the mobility. I love the accessibility of the technology and how multifaceted it is. And I like tools too that allow academic usage and creative usage. And I think that there's not many technology solutions that cross that boundary very easily.
Mm.
And the Apple Pencil does that. So I'm a huge fan of that tech and I use it all the time. So it's not even like relatively new, but I still love her. What's yours?
I think uh I always say like AI. Just because I love you, I think it's so fun to use, and actually, we've been playing around in some of our content using it in jokes, and some of them are a lot better at jokes than others. Um, and so I just have so much fun with them. But I actually really like your answer. I love my iPad and my Apple Pencil. It's the writing. I love being able to write while also not like throwing away copious amounts of paper all the time. Um, yeah, and it just the ease of like usage. A huge fan actually. So that's a really good answer. I don't think that's old at all. I think that's very relevant, very awesome. I'm using an iPad to record right now actually. Um, Okay, well, this has been an incredible conversation, Kyla. I'm so glad that we were able to have you on. I think folks are going to get a lot from this conversation, learn a lot, hopefully get inspired. Hopefully, we can convince more folks to take leadership positions and continue to bring impact and change into the tech space. Really looking forward to some of these follow-up conversations on connectivity and some of the other topics that we touched on, because there's so many conversations to have, folks, around all of this, particularly for our generation. To close this out, Kyla, I think what I want to ask is where can people follow your work and learn more about what's going on with you and the Siegel Family Endowment?
Yeah, LinkedIn is unfortunately the best place. That platform is, I'm not a fan, but I am there and Siegel is there. You can find me at our website too, and you can find my email. But happy to connect and so grateful for the opportunity for this conversation. This was so lovely and restorative, and looking forward to all the future conversations around these topics that are so important.
Yeah, thank you so much.